The sun, a benevolent eye in the vast Montana sky, warmed Ilara's face as she stood on the porch of the Grand Ranch house, her gaze sweeping across the endless, rolling grasslands that were now her home, her heritage. A quiet strength settled in her shoulders, a stark contrast to the trembling child who had once believed herself to be nothing more than dust under a callous heel. But that was a lifetime ago, before the trail, before the dust and despair had given way to an unexpected dawn. She remembered the biting wind, not of this peaceful morning, but of a day steeped in the bitterness of a child's unraveling world. It had whipped Silas's threadbare coat around his gaunt frame, mirroring the cold fury that always seemed to simmer within him. Ilara, no more than 7 summers old, stumbled beside him, her small hand lost in his calloused grip, a grip that felt more like a vice than a comfort. The trail was a merciless ribbon of grit and sorrow, stretching endlessly under a sky too vast, too indifferent to her plight. Each stone her worn boots encountered was a fresh pain, each gust of wind a whisper of the desolation that was fast becoming her only companion. Silas hadn't spoken for miles, not since the meager contents of their food sack had dwindled to crumbs. His silence was a heavy blanket, suffocating Ilara's faint hopes that this journey, unlike all the others, might lead to something other than another slammed door, another town that wanted no part of a drifter and his waif-like daughter. His face, when she dared to glance up, was a mask of grim resolve, his eyes fixed on a horizon that promised him relief, but her, only oblivion. He stopped abruptly where the trail forked, one path leading towards the faint promise of distant mountains, the other snaking into a barren, unforgiving expanse of rock and sagebrush. He let go of her hand. The sudden absence of his harsh touch was almost as shocking as the words that followed, words that shattered the fragile remnants of her child's world. "This is as far as I take you, girl," he rasped, his voice devoid of any emotion save a chilling finality. "You're a stone round my neck, a burden I can't carry no more." Ilara stared, her breath catching in her throat. Surely, he didn't mean it. Surely, this was another of his cruel jests. But the emptiness in his eyes told her otherwise. He turned, his back a rigid line of denial, and began to walk away down the path leading towards the mountains, never once looking back. The dust swirled around his retreating figure, slowly obscuring him from her sight, each step he took severing the last, frayed thread of her belonging. She watched, a small, frozen statue of disbelief, until he was gone, swallowed by the vast, uncaring landscape. Then, the silence descended, absolute and terrifying, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant hawk and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She was alone, a tiny speck in an immense wilderness, with nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and a crushing weight of despair that threatened to pull her down into the very dust of the trail. The sun, moments before a distant observer, now seemed to beat down with malevolent force, baking the tears onto her grimy cheeks as she sank to her knees, the harsh reality of her abandonment settling in like a shroud. The shadows were beginning to lengthen, painting the desolate landscape in hues of purple and grey, when a sound, faint at first, then growing steadily stronger, reached Ilara's ears. It was the rhythmic beat of hooves, a sound alien to the profound silence that had enveloped her for what felt like an eternity. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her daze. Silas had warned her of wild animals, of men crueler than himself, though she could scarcely imagine such a thing. She pressed herself against a rough outcrop of rock, trying to become invisible, her small body trembling like a trapped bird. The rider emerged from the shimmering heat haze, a tall figure on a powerful, dark horse, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. He moved with an easy grace, his presence commanding yet somehow not threatening. As he drew closer, Ilara could make out details, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face that seemed carved from weathered oak, a stern set to his jaw, but eyes that scanned the trail with a keen, observant intensity. This was Mr. Alastair Thorne, owner of the sprawling Bar M Ranch, a man whose name was spoken with respect, and sometimes a touch of awe, throughout the territory. He was a man of few words but immense influence, known for his fairness but also for a certain solitary nature, a quiet sorrow that clung to him like the scent of pine and leather. He saw her then. A small, crumpled heap of misery by the side of the trail. He reined in his horse, the animal snorting softly, its breath misting in the cooling air. For a long moment, he simply looked, his expression unreadable. Ilara held her breath, expecting harsh words, a command to be gone, or worse. Instead, he dismounted with a slow, deliberate movement, his spurs jingling softly, the only sound in the vast emptiness. He didn't approach her directly, but walked a few paces off, as if to give her space, his gaze taking in the tiny, scuffed boots, the tear-streaked face, the utter desolation in her posture. "Child," he said, his voice deeper than she expected, surprisingly gentle, like the rumble of distant thunder. "What are you doing out here alone?" Elara couldn't speak. Words were a frozen lump in her throat. She could only stare, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, unvoiced plea. He saw the raw fear, the imprint of harshness in the way she flinched when he took a step closer. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level, his movements careful, unhurried. "Are you lost?" he asked, his tone softer still. She managed a tiny shake of her head, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. His gaze softened further, a flicker of something unreadable, compassion, perhaps even a shared understanding of sorrow, passing through his eyes. He didn't press for answers she was clearly unable to give. He simply reached out a large, calloused hand, not to grab, but palm up, an offering. "Come now," he said, his voice still quiet but firm with an underlying authority. "Night's falling. It's no place for a little one. You can come with me." The silence stretched, filled only by Elara's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, hesitantly, as if drawn by an invisible thread of kindness she hadn't felt in a lifetime, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the bruising grip she had known. He lifted her as easily as if she were a doll, settling her in front of him on the saddle. The world tilted, then steadied, as he swung himself up behind her. The warmth of his body was a shield against the evening chill, a foreign sensation of safety that she hadn't dared to dream existed. Without another word, he turned the horse, leaving the desolate fork in the trail behind, and rode towards the unseen promise of the Bar M, the fading light guiding them towards an unknown future. The journey to the Bar M ranch house felt like a dream, blurred by exhaustion and the surreal nature of her rescue. Elara, nestled securely against Mr. Thorne's sturdy frame, drifted in and out of a light, troubled sleep, the rhythmic sway of the horse a strange lullaby. She was vaguely aware of vast, dark shapes of land stretching out on either side, the air growing cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. When they finally arrived, the main house loomed before them, larger than any building Elara had ever seen, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness of the night. It was a fortress of timber and stone, solid and enduring, yet the light promised sanctuary. Mr. Thorne dismounted, lifting her down as gently as before. Her legs felt like jelly, and she swayed, but his hand was there, steadying her. He led her towards the wide porch, the heavy oak door opening before they reached it, spilling more light onto the steps. A woman stood framed in the doorway, her figure matronly, her face etched with concern that softened into surprise as she took in the sight of the small, disheveled child beside her employer. This was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose stern exterior hid a heart as warm as the kitchen hearth she meticulously tended. "Mr. Thorne! What on earth?" she began, her voice a mixture of surprise and quiet alarm. "Found her on the Cimarron Fork," Martha, Thorne said, his voice tired but firm. "Alone. Needs food, a bath, and a warm bed." He didn't offer further explanation, and Mrs. Gable, accustomed to his laconic ways and recognizing the unspoken urgency, didn't press. Her gaze fell upon Elara, taking in the matted hair, the torn dress, the wide, frightened eyes that seemed to absorb everything without betraying a single thought. A flicker of deep compassion crossed Mrs. Gable's face. She'd seen hardship before, but there was a particular brand of desolation clinging to this child that tugged at her heartstrings. "Mercy me, the poor lamb," she murmured, her initial surprise giving way to a bustling efficiency. "Come in, child, come in out of the cold." Elara hesitated, her gaze darting from Mrs. Gable's kind face to the imposing figure of Mr. Thorne, then to the shadowy depths of the house behind them. It was all so new, so overwhelming. The sheer size of the entrance hall, with its polished wooden floors and high ceilings, made her feel even smaller, more insignificant. The air smelled of beeswax and something savory cooking, a stark contrast to the perpetual scent of dust and despair that had been her constant companion. Mrs. Gable, sensing her fear, knelt, her movement slow and reassuring. "Don't you worry now, dear. You're safe here. We'll get you settled." Her voice was gentle, like the cooing of doves Elara had once heard in a forgotten town square. Elara allowed herself to be led, her hand still loosely held in Mr. Thorne's, as if she feared letting go would plunge her back into the terrifying aloneness of the trail. He released her hand only when Mrs. Gable gently took it, guiding her towards a staircase that seemed to wind endlessly upwards. Mr. Thorne watched them go, his expression thoughtful, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes before he turned towards the glowing embers in the massive stone fireplace, a silent sentinel in his own domain, the unexpected arrival of the small, broken child echoing in the quiet vastness of his home. For Elara, the world had tilted on its axis once more, from the raw desolation of abandonment to this strange, imposing sanctuary, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty, a silent, watchful observer in a new and bewildering world. The days that followed her arrival at the Bar M were a blur of quiet solicitude and overwhelming newness for Elara. Mrs. Gable, with a gentle practicality that soothed more than any effusive display of sympathy could have, tended to her physical needs. A warm bath in a large copper tub washed away the grime of the trail, revealing skin pale and thin, crisscrossed with faint, fading bruises that spoke of a harsh past. The threadbare dress she had arrived in was replaced with soft, clean clothes, simple but mended, that felt like a caress against her skin. Food appeared regularly, warm and nourishing, stew, fresh bread, milk still warm from the cow. At first, Elara ate little, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to accept much, her eyes constantly darting, expecting a harsh word, a sudden blow, the revocation of this tentative kindness. She slept in a small room tucked away at the end of a long corridor, the bed softer than anything she had ever known, yet sleep was often elusive, haunted by shadows and the lingering echo of Silas's cruel words. She remained largely silent, a little ghost flitting through the large, echoing rooms of the ranch house. Words seemed too dangerous, too likely to invite unwanted attention or retribution. Her voice, when she had last used it to plead with her father, had brought only his scorn. So she kept her thoughts locked away, her face a carefully composed mask of neutrality, though her eyes, large and luminous, absorbed everything. Mr. Thorne was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He didn't force her to speak or interact. He would nod to her if their paths crossed, a quiet acknowledgement of her existence. Sometimes, she would find small, unexpected offerings left for her, a polished stone from the riverbed on her windowsill, a brightly colored autumn leaf tucked beside her plate at breakfast, once even a roughly carved wooden bird, its form simple but imbued with a surprising tenderness. She never touched them when he was looking, but in the quiet moments when she believed herself unobserved, her small fingers would trace the outlines of these silent gifts, a flicker of fragile wonder in her eyes. Mrs. Gable would talk to her in a low, soothing murmur as she went about her chores, recounting stories of the ranch, of the changing seasons, of the animals, never demanding a response, simply filling the silence with a comforting human sound. Elara would listen, her head slightly tilted, a tiny seed of trust beginning to germinate in the barren soil of her heart. She learned the rhythms of the ranch house, the early morning clatter from the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon, the heavy tread of Mr. Thorne's boots as he left before dawn, the quiet hum of the house during the day, and his return at dusk, bringing with him the scent of horses and the outdoors. One afternoon, while she was sitting on the porch steps, tracing patterns in the dust with a twig, a large, boisterous dog, one of Thorne's cattle dogs named Blue, bounded up to her, tail wagging furiously, and dropped a slabbery stick at her feet. Elara froze, her breath catching. Silas had hated dogs, had kicked them often. But Blue merely cocked his head, nudged the stick with his nose, and let out a soft woof, his intelligent eyes full of playful expectation. Hesitantly, Elara reached out a trembling hand and touched the dog's soft fur. Blue responded by licking her hand, a warm, wet caress. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Elara's lips, the first Mr. Thorne, watching unnoticed from his study window, had ever seen. It was a fragile beginning, a tentative unfurling, like a desert flower after a rare rain, this slow, painstaking process of learning to trust in a world that had, until now, offered her only pain. The vastness of the Bar M was, at first, another source of intimidation for Ilara. Beyond the relative safety of the main house and its immediate yard lay miles of rolling pasture, shadowed coulees, and distant, brooding hills. It was a world teeming with unfamiliar sounds and activities, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of ranch hands, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Yet, slowly, drawn by a curiosity that even her fear couldn't entirely suppress, Ilara began to venture further, always keeping the reassuring bulk of the house within sight. Mr. Thorne seemed to understand her need to explore her new surroundings on her own terms. He never overtly encouraged or forbade her wanderings, but she often sensed his distant, watchful eye. Sometimes, he would be mending a fence in a nearby paddock, and he would simply nod as she passed, his presence a silent reassurance rather than a constraint. Mrs. Gable, too, played a subtle role in expanding Ilara's world. She began to give Ilara small, simple tasks, shelling peas on the porch, fetching herbs from the kitchen garden, or carefully winding yarn. These tasks were not burdens, but anchors, giving Ilara a sense of purpose, a feeling, however faint, of contributing, of belonging. She took to these duties with a quiet diligence that impressed the housekeeper. One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Gable asked Ilara to accompany her to the chicken coop to collect eggs. Ilara had never been so close to chickens before, and she watched, fascinated, as Mrs. Gable moved amongst them with practiced ease, her voice a soothing murmur to the clucking hens. "Would you like to try, child?" Mrs. Gable asked, holding out the basket. Ilara hesitated, then nodded, her small hand reaching tentatively under a nesting hen. The hen shifted, but didn't peck, and Ilara's fingers closed around a smooth, warm egg. A thrill, small but potent, shot through her. It was a simple thing, yet it felt like a victory. As she placed the egg carefully into the basket, she looked up to see Mr. Thorne leaning against the corral fence, watching them. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was a softness in his gaze, a quiet approval that warmed her more than the morning sun. Later that week, a minor incident occurred that subtly solidified Ilara's nascent sense of security. A new ranch hand, a rough-looking fellow named Jed, unfamiliar with Ilara's silent presence, saw her sitting on the porch steps and, assuming she was a stray or a beggar's child, spoke to her harshly. "What are you doing here, brat?" "Git, for I call the dogs on ya proper." Ilara flinched violently, shrinking back, the familiar terror washing over her. Before she could even think to flee, Mr. Thorne's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a winter wind. "That child is under my roof, Jed. And under my protection. You'll speak to her with respect, or you'll find yourself off my land before sundown." Jed, visibly shaken by his employer's unexpected and steely intervention, stammered an apology and quickly retreated. Mr. Thorne didn't look at Ilara immediately, but turned back to his work, as if the incident were closed. Yet, the message was clear, not just to Jed, but to Ilara. He had defended her. He had claimed her, in a way, as his. That evening, as Mrs. Gable tucked her into bed, Ilara spoke, her voice barely a whisper, the first voluntary word she had uttered in weeks. "Mr. Thorne, he was..." She struggled to find the word. "He was good," Mrs. Gable smiled, her eyes gentle. "Yes, child. He is a good man," and in the quiet darkness of her room, Ilara felt a tiny seed of belonging take root, a fragile tendril reaching towards the unexpected kindness that had found her on a desolate trail. The quiet rhythm of life on the Bar M, however, could not entirely erase the long, dark shadows of Ilara's past. Memories of Silas, of their harsh, nomadic existence, of the constant fear and hunger, lay dormant, ready to be stirred by the slightest tremor. One afternoon, a peddler's wagon rumbled up the long drive to the ranch house. Such arrivals were infrequent and usually a source of mild excitement, a break from the routine. Mrs. Gable went out to see his wares, and Ilara, curious, trailed behind her, keeping a safe distance. The peddler was a thin, wiry man with shifty eyes and a wheedling voice that reminded Ilara, with a sickening lurch, of some of Silas's less reputable acquaintances. As he displayed his goods, cheap trinkets, bolts of cloth, and household necessities, he began to speak of news from the wider territory, of happenings in distant towns. And then he mentioned a name that struck Elara like a physical blow: Silas. Heard tell of a drifter named Silas causing trouble down near Willow Creek, the peddler said, oblivious to the small, frozen figure near the porch steps. Got himself locked up for theft and brawling, they say. A mean one. By all accounts, Elara's blood ran cold. Willow Creek wasn't so far away. The world, which had begun to feel safe, suddenly seemed precarious again. The image of Silas, his face contorted in anger, rose vividly in her mind. What if he got out? What if he came looking for her? The old, familiar terror, the kind that squeezed her chest and made it hard to breathe, surged back with overwhelming force. She turned and fled, bolting into the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the peddler's careless words echoing in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached her little room, where she huddled under the covers, trembling uncontrollably, the carefully constructed walls of her newfound security crumbling around her. Mrs. Gable found her there later, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror the housekeeper hadn't seen since the child's first days at the ranch. Gently, patiently, Mrs. Gable coaxed the story from her, piecing together the fragmented whispers about Willow Creek, and Silas' understanding dawned in her eyes. When Mr. Thorne returned that evening, Mrs. Gable spoke to him quietly in his study. Elara, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, strained to hear. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard the concern in Mrs. Gable's voice and the low, reassuring rumble of Mr. Thorne's responses. Later, he came to her room. He didn't turn on the lamp, but sat on the edge of her bed in the dim twilight. He didn't speak for a long time, simply sat there, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the darkness. Then, he said, his voice unusually gentle, Elara. It was one of the first times he had used her name directly. That man, Silas. He can't hurt you here. His voice was firm, unwavering, a statement of absolute conviction. This is your home now. You are safe here. I won't let anyone take you away, or cause you harm. You have my word. He didn't touch her, didn't make any grand gestures, but his quiet promise, spoken in the dimly lit room, resonated with a power that reached deep into Elara's frightened heart. It was more than just words, it was a bulwark against the encroaching shadows of her past. She looked at him, at the strong, kind lines of his face barely visible in the gloom, and for the first time, a genuine sense of safety, profound and deeply felt, began to settle over her. He was her protector, her shield. The shadow of Silas still lingered, but it no longer had the power to consume her. Mr. Thorne's word was a light in that darkness. As weeks turned into months, Elara blossomed under the quiet, steady care of Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Gable. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a growing curiosity and, at times, even a spark of childish mischief. She started to speak more, her voice initially hesitant, like a rusty gate creaking open, but gradually gaining confidence. She asked questions about the ranch, the animals, the changing seasons, her thirst for knowledge insatiable. Mr. Thorne, in his understated way, became her teacher. He taught her the names of the wildflowers that dotted the prairie in spring, showed her how to identify the tracks of different animals, and even began to let her accompany him on short rides around the ranch, seated securely in front of him on his steady old gelding. These excursions were the highlight of Elara's days. From her perch, she saw the world from a new perspective, the vastness of the Bar M no longer intimidating, but a place of endless discovery. He would point out a hawk circling high above, explain the importance of rotating pastures for the cattle, or share a quiet observation about the way the light fell on the distant mountains. He never preached, never lectured, but his words, simple and direct, painted a picture of a life lived in harmony with the land, a life of hard work, responsibility, and a deep, abiding respect for nature. However, the tranquility of their evolving bond was destined to be tested. News of the orphan girl at the Bar M had slowly trickled into the small nearby town of Redemption. Whispers and speculation followed. Some were sympathetic, but others, fueled by ignorance and suspicion, were less charitable. A faction in the town, led by a self-righteous deacon named Josiah Pringle, began to voice concerns about an unchaperoned child of unknown origin being raised by a bachelor rancher, however wealthy and respected he might be. Pringle, a man whose piety often masked a meddling and judgmental nature, saw it as his moral duty to intervene. One Sunday, after the sparse church service, Deacon Pringle, accompanied by two equally stern-faced town elders, rode out to the bar. Mr. Thorne met them on the porch, his expression unreadable, Elara hovering nervously in the doorway behind him, partially shielded by his tall frame. "Mr. Thorne," Pringle began, his tone officious, "we've come on a matter of some delicacy. It concerns the child." Elara Thorne's eyes, which had been calmly surveying the deacon, narrowed slightly. "The child is well, Deacon. She lacks for nothing." "That may be so, in a material sense," Pringle pressed on, puffing out his chest. "But there are proprieties to consider. Her origins are unknown. Her spiritual welfare, her upbringing in a household without a woman's guidance, save for a housekeeper." His voice trailed off, laden with insinuation. Elara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She knew this tone, this judgmental gaze. It was the precursor to rejection, to being cast out. But Mr. Thorne stood unmovable, a bulwark of quiet strength. "Mrs. Gable is more woman than most, Deacon," Thorne stated, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. "And as for Elara's welfare, spiritual or otherwise, it is my concern. And mine alone, but the community has a right to." Pringle sputtered, taken aback by Thorne's firm rebuttal. "The community," Thorne interrupted, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet, "would do well to tend to its own souls before casting judgment on a child who has known more hardship than any of you could fathom. Elara is here because she needed refuge, and she found it. She stays because this is her home." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the three men, leaving no doubt as to his resolve. "And she is mine to care for. That is all that needs to be said on the matter. Good day, gentlemen." With that, he turned, gently guiding Elara back into the house, and closed the door, leaving Pringle and his companion standing dumbfounded on the porch. Inside, Elara looked up at Mr. Thorne, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a profound gratitude swelling in her chest. He hadn't just defended her, he had claimed her, openly and unequivocally, before the disapproving eyes of the world. He had stood as her champion. The deacon's unwelcome visit, though unsettling, served to solidify Mr. Thorne's resolve regarding Elara's future. He had made his stance clear to the town, but he knew that whispers and doubts could linger, potentially casting a shadow over Elara's life as she grew. He wanted more for her than just tacit acceptance. He wanted her to have unquestionable belonging, a legal and emotional foundation that no amount of gossip or ill will could erode. A few weeks later, Mr. Thorne announced he had business in Helena, the territorial capital, a journey of several days. He arranged for one of the most trusted senior ranch hands and his wife to stay at the main house with Mrs. Gable to ensure everything ran smoothly and Elara felt secure. Elara felt a pang of anxiety at his departure, so accustomed had she become to his steadying presence, but she trusted him implicitly. He returned a week later, looking tired from the journey, but with a new light in his eyes, a sense of quiet satisfaction. That evening, after supper, he called Elara and Mrs. Gable into his study. The room, usually reserved for ranch business and quiet contemplation, felt different, charged with a gentle solemnity. On his large oak desk lay a crisp, official-looking document. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, a rare sign of nervousness from the usually stoic man. "Elara," he began, his voice softer than usual. He picked up the document. "I went to Helena for a number of reasons. The most important one concerned you." He paused, looking directly at her, his gaze filled with a warmth that enveloped her like the softest blanket. "This paper," he said, holding it out slightly, "is from the territorial court. It says that Elara, formerly of no known permanent address, is now Elara Thorne. It says that you are, by law and by my own heart, my daughter." Elara stared at the document, then at his face, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his words. His daughter? The word echoed in the quiet room, filled with a resonance that made her heart ache with an almost unbearable sweetness. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image, blurring the official script on the paper. Mrs. Gable, standing beside her, let out a soft, emotional sigh, her own eyes glistening. She placed a comforting hand on Elara's shoulder. "He means it, child," she whispered. Every word. Mr. Thorne set the paper down and knelt before Elara, bringing himself to her eye level, much as he had done on that desolate trail months ago. But this time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a dawning, radiant joy. "I know I ain't much like other fathers," he said, a hint of uncharacteristic vulnerability in his voice. "And this ranch ain't much like other homes, perhaps. But it's yours, Elara. And you are mine. If that's what you want." Elara couldn't speak. She simply launched herself at him, her small arms wrapping around his strong neck, clinging to him with all the strength she possessed. She buried her face in his shoulder, and for the first time since her mother had died years ago, she wept freely, not tears of sorrow or fear, but tears of profound relief, of overwhelming gratitude, of a love so immense it filled every corner of her being. Mr. Thorne held her close, his own eye suspiciously bright, his large hand patting her back gently. "There now, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "There now. You're home. You're truly home." In that moment, the last vestiges of the abandoned child on the trail vanished, replaced by Elara Thorne, daughter of a wealthy rancher, yes, but more importantly, the cherished child of a good and loving man. The meaning of family, once a distant, painful memory, had been redefined, reborn in the quiet strength of a shared study and the unwavering commitment in a man's honest eyes. The years that followed were transformative for Elara Thorne. With the security of a name, a home, and an unwavering paternal love, the timid, silent child blossomed into a confident and capable young woman. The Bar M Ranch was not just her refuge, it became her classroom, her playground, and eventually, her responsibility. Mr. Thorne, true to his word, raised her as his own. He taught her not just the practical skills of ranching, how to ride with the best of his hands, to understand the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of the livestock, to mend fences and manage supplies, but also the deeper lessons of integrity, compassion, and stewardship of the land. Elara absorbed it all, her keen mind and resilient spirit eager to learn and to contribute. She developed a particular affinity for the horses, her gentle touch and quiet understanding echoing Mr. Thorne's own connection with the animals. She spent hours in the stables and on the range, her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now ringing out freely as she rode alongside the man she called Pa. Mrs. Gable, a steadfast presence, taught her the arts of the household, but also shared her quiet wisdom about life, about kindness, and about the strength found in gentle persistence. Elara learned to cook and bake, to sew and mend, not as chores, but as acts of care and contribution to the home they had built together. She attended the small school in Redemption when it was in session, proving to be a quick and diligent student, but her truest education came from the land and the people of the Bar M. The townsfolk, witnessing her growth and the undeniable bond between her and Mr. Thorne, gradually forgot their earlier misgivings. Deacon Pringle still maintained a certain stiff formality, but even he could not deny the positive transformation in the girl, nor the quiet joy she had brought to the often solitary rancher. Elara, in turn, never forgot the hardship of her early years. It instilled in her a profound empathy for others who struggled. She was quick to offer a kind word to a discouraged ranch hand, to share her food with a traveler passing through, or to tend to an injured animal with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to witness. One particularly harsh winter, when a blizzard trapped several families in outlying homesteads, it was Elara, barely a teenager but already possessing remarkable fortitude, who rode with Mr. Thorne and a rescue party, bringing food and aid, her courage belying her youth. She became known not just as Thorne's daughter, but as a young woman of quiet strength, deep compassion, and a wisdom beyond her years. She was the heart of the Bar M, her presence a gentle light that softened the ranch's rugged edges and filled its vast spaces with warmth. Mr. Thorne, watching her ride across the pastures, her hair flying in the wind, her face alight with purpose, would often feel a swell of pride so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The lost, broken child he had found on a desolate trail had not only survived but had thrived, becoming a testament to the enduring power of kindness and the unexpected gifts of a found family. She was his daughter, his legacy, and his greatest joy, a bright bloom in the once barren landscape of his own heart. As Elara stepped into young womanhood, her presence on the Bar M became indispensable. She possessed her father's keen eye for livestock, his intuitive understanding of the land, and a quiet authority that the ranch hands respected. Mr. Thorne, while still very much the patriarch, increasingly relied on her judgment and partnership. They were a team, their bond forged in shared hardship and deepened by years of mutual love and respect. The prosperity of the Bar M grew, not just in acreage or herds, but in spirit, a testament to their combined efforts. Ilara never lost the quiet thoughtfulness that had characterized her even as a child, but it was now interwoven with a serene confidence. She managed the household accounts with Mrs. Gable, oversaw the breeding programs for their prized horses, and often rode out to the furthest reaches of the ranch, ensuring all was well, her presence a reassuring sight to everyone who worked there. One spring, a new family arrived in the Redemption area, immigrants from a war-torn European country, their faces etched with hardship and the uncertainty of a new life in an unfamiliar land. They had little, and the local welcome was, in some quarters, decidedly cool, suspicion and prejudice rearing their ugly heads once more. Ilara heard their story, saw their worn clothes and the haunted look in the children's eyes, a look she remembered all too well from her own reflection years ago. Without hesitation, she organized a collection of supplies from the Bar MS ample stores, blankets, food, tools, and even a few gentle milk cows. She rode out to their small, struggling homestead herself, not as the wealthy rancher's daughter, but simply as a neighbor offering a hand. She spoke to them in simple, kind terms, her empathy transcending any language barrier. She saw the initial fear and distrust in their eyes gradually replaced by a dawning hope, much like her own transformation years before. Mr. Thorne watched her go, a quiet pride filling him. She was living the lessons he had tried to impart, not through preaching, but through example. She was extending the same compassion that had once saved her. The cycle of kindness was continuing, rippling outwards from the heart of the Bar M years later, after Mr. Thorne had passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving the entirety of his vast estate and his enduring legacy to his beloved daughter. Ilara stood on that familiar porch, the same benevolent sun warming her face. The ranch was thriving, a beacon of prosperity and good stewardship in the territory. Mrs. Gable, now elderly but still spry, sat beside her, her hand resting on Ilara's. Ilara was no longer just Ilara Thorne, the rancher's daughter, she was the matriarch of the Bar M, respected and loved, a woman who had turned profound adversity into profound strength. Occasionally, new drifters or families down on their luck would find their way to the ranch, drawn by its reputation for fairness and generosity. Ilara always met them with an open heart and a helping hand, seeing in their vulnerable faces a reflection of the lost child she once was. She knew that hope could be found in the most unexpected places, that kindness could change a life, that a desolate trail could, against all odds, lead to home. And as the sun began to set, painting the vast Montana sky in hues of orange and rose, she knew that the greatest legacy her father had left her was not the land or the wealth, but the unwavering belief in the enduring strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of calling someone your own. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying not the chill of abandonment, but the promise of continued hope, a testament to a love that had bridged the chasm of despair and built a future as vast and as beautiful as the land itself. If you had found Ilara on that trail, would you have stopped or walked on like everyone else? Let us know in the comments. They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. Subscribe now because tomorrow's story will delve even deeper into the heart of resilience.